to the third and final AUC Art Collective Distinguished Lecture of the academic year. My name is Cheryl Finley, and I'm the director of the Atlanta University Center Art History and Curatorial Studies Collective, serving undergraduate students at the largest HBCU network in the country, comprising Clark Atlanta University, Spelman College, and Morehouse College. With the generous support of the Alice L. Walton Foundation, our mission is to prepare the next generation of African-American art historians, curators, and art industry leaders. Our program, which operates out of the Department of Art and Visual Culture at Spelman College, offers a major and minor in art history and a minor in curatorial studies. I would like to acknowledge the hard work and collaboration of the AUC Art Collective team, including Rachel Brown and Lauren Harris, the faculty of the Department of Art and Visual Culture, including Chair Myra Green, Division Chair of the Arts, and Ayoka Chinzera, and also the Provost, Sharon Davies, and Dr. Mary Schmidt-Campbell, the 10th President of Spelman College. I also wish to celebrate the hard work of our students, and we're so proud to announce that our first graduating class is coming this May. So look out for our first graduating class in mid-May. Now, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Richard J. Powell this evening, who will be sharing a new work titled The Price of Blackness, African-American Art in the New Century, a title that I believe is apropos of the moment given yesterday's events. Dr. Richard J. Powell, who is a member of the Morehouse class of 1975, is a recognized authority on African-American art and culture and a frequent lecturer and media commentator on this topic, both in the United States and abroad. He has organized numerous art exhibitions, most notably the Blues Aesthetic, Black Culture and Modernism in 1989, Rhapsodies in Black, Art of the Harlem Renaissance in 1997, to Conserve A Legacy, American Art at Historically Black Colleges and Universities, premiering at Clark Atlanta University Art Museum in 1999, Back to Black, Art, Cinema, and the Racial Imaginary in 2005, and Archibald Motley, Jazz, Age Modernist in 2014. Among the major museums where his curated exhibitions have been presented are the Phillips Academy's Addison Gallery of American Art, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the New Orleans Museum of Art, London's Whitechapel Art Gallery, and the Whitney Museum of American Art. Along with his teaching of courses in American art, the arts of the African diaspora, and contemporary visual studies, Dr. Powell has written extensively on topics ranging from primitivism to postmodernism, including such titles as Homegoing, The Art and Life of William H. Johnson in 1991, Black Art, A Cultural History in 1997 and republished in 2002. And I think we're going to hear about this again in the coming year. And Cutting a Figure, Fashioning Black Portraiture in 2008. From 2007 until 2010, Dr. Powell was editor-in-chief of the Art Bulletin, the world's leading English language journal in art history. In 2013, Powell received the Lawrence A. Fleischman Award for Scholarly Excellence in the field of American history from the Smithsonian's Archives of American Art. And in 2016, he was honored at the College Art Association's annual conference as the year's most distinguished scholar. His latest book, Going There, Black Visual Satire, published by Yale University Press last year, examines satirical cartoons, paintings, films, and videos by modern and contemporary African-American artists. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Richard J. Powell. Welcome, Rick.
Thank you so much, Dr. Finley. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
And can you see me?
We can see you, and we can see your beautiful book there behind you too.
Thank you so much. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Oops. Okay, let's see what's happening here. Okay. I'm not seeing what I had up here. This is what happens when you, let's see. I had it there. Let's stop sharing. Okay. Oh, here's my desktop. Okay. Let's share that. Okay. We just showed my screen and I ran through my slides and let's see what happens. Okay, this is not acting right. Okay, so I'm gonna stop for a second. Of Art and Visual Culture and the AUC Art History and Curatorial Studies Collective. It's a real honor to do this. My slides are just flying really fast and quick. I want to dedicate my talk this evening to Dr. Mary Schmidt Campbell, the president of Spelman College and the former executive director of the Studio Museum in Harlem. And what you're looking at is a photograph from 1978 that I took with Dr. Campbell and program coordinator at the Studio Museum in at Harlem, David Earl Jackson. And as you can see, they're standing in front of a very, very lovely Buford Delaney street scene. So I thank Dr. Campbell for all that she has done and continues to do in the field of higher education, as well as art and visual culture. Fin de siècle blues. In 2000, the performance artist Pope L installed a 10-foot pyramidal wooden armature in New York's Sculpture Center, on top of which he mounted a porcelain toilet bowl where he sat naked while reading, chewing, and spitting out chunks of the Wall Street Journal. First performed in 1991, this latest iteration of eating the Wall Street Journal reflected Pope L's interests in linguistic structures, social categories, and socioeconomic stratifications, here all filtered through a reenactment of informational consumption and elimination. In Eat Notes, the accompanying publication for this performance, Pope L writes, "Consuming is not just about taking in. No, it's also about being taken in, a kind of inebriation, delusion, pleasure, terror, and analgesic, all simultaneous, yet broken and jumbled. Note, go ask Alice." Obliquely referring at this passage's ending to the protagonist in Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventure in Wonderland, who accidentally falls into an alternative universe and struggles to comprehend that world's arcane symbols and syntaxes and social systems. Pope L sarcastically likened the Wall Street Journal to an edible manna or a palliative from a capitalism-driven heaven. But is suggested in Pope L's elevated throne and its life tower form, these symbolic acts of consumption, expectoration, and defecation were envisaged from a perspicacious yet hallucinatory place. In another citation from Alice's Adventure in Wonderland, Pope L told Lowry Stokes Sims that Blackness has always been a kind of rabbit hole, an uncertainty of someone else's making. This hole of disenfranchisement and seeing one's destiny at the bottom of a political and ideological hierarchy offered Pope L the fresh prospects of analyzing and politicizing this unstable position. And like many other Black artists at this historic juncture, to enter the 21st century wholly cognizant of the preconceptions, contradictions, and absurdities that Blackness navigated within the larger culture. Blackness for Sale, one of several media work created at the dawn of the new millennia by artists Keith and Mindy Obadike, followed Pope L's example in creating a conceptual work that troubled an unreflected engagement with racial identity. Utilizing the online auction preference on the website for the electronic commerce company eBay, Keith Obadike composed an advertisement that allowed prospective buyers to bid on his Blackness as if race was an article of trade, sarcastically guaranteeing a certificate of authenticity and glibly acknowledging its benefits as well as its handicaps. Obadike's sale, despite its eventual cancellation by eBay, initiated much philosophical rumination around what constituted Blackness and raised important questions concerning the commercializing of culture and the objectification of people, musings and forebodings that persisted well into the new century. Among the benefits and warnings in Keith Obadike's auction notice were two somewhat curious, irreconcilable disclosures. The first, that this Blackness may be used for creating Black art. And the second, that the seller does not recommend that this Blackness be used in the process of making or selling serious art. On the one hand, flippant, and on the other hand, cautionary and facetious. The two commendations insinuated, as with much of the art produced at this point in time, a markedly dissimilar attitude from previous art historical moments, substituting irony for optimism and skepticism for pride. Obadike's Blackness for sale and other doubt-generating art were, for all their despair and abjectness, purposeful and political. They shared a commitment to an ethic whose part ecstatic, part diagnostic temperament was characteristic of a modern African-American blues aesthetic, and whose main mission was enabling an intersectional approach to creative exchanges and engagements across geographical and political borders. As especially seen in the works of artists from Africa and the Caribbean, the other unspoken debts were artistic themes and narratives that, on the cusp of a new century with unsure and often unsettling outlooks, touched on a range of timely issues, such as nationalism, migration, homelessness, global violence, and environmental destruction. With these questions at the forefront of many artistic strategies throughout the African diaspora, a work like Pope L's Eating the Wall Street Journal feels more like an absurdist solo version of Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper, its solitary diner forever suspended in an indeterminacy or an extreme dread about the future. After the deluge. Among the commissioned works and special projects for Prospect One, New Orleans, a sprawling citywide art event in 2008 envisioned to revitalize New Orleans, Louisiana in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. Artist Mark Bradford's Mithra attracted throngs of admirers and, relatedly, elicited a surplus of emotions. Bradford's sculpture, 3 vertically stacked, 40 feet long steel shipping containers encased in a plywood facade that evoked a ship's hull and covered with torn and peeling posters and advertising circulars, referenced inner city decay and migratory transience, societal concerns and geopolitical circumstances that proliferated during the first decades of the new century. Seemingly moored in the Crescent City's still decimated lower Ninth Ward, Mithra was Bradford's grand materialization of an impoverished but resourceful urban milieu, and conversely, a wry commentary on displacement and abandonment, exigencies emanating from environmental malfeasance and societal inequities on a global scale. That peoples of African descent were the most likely victims of these catastrophes was not lost on Mithra's audience. And factoring in the human costs of infrastructural neglect and environmental underdevelopment One might conclude that, to paraphrase Zora Neale Hurston in her Depression-era novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God, vessels such as Mithra, which have humanity's hopes on board too often, sail forever on the horizon, never landing until the watcher turns his eyes away in resignation, his dreams mocked to death by time. Lost Americans, a mixed media painting by artist Thornton Dial, conveyed a similar fatalism as Mark Bradford's Mithra, but materialized in a murky accumulation of debris comprising the dregs of post-industrial Black lives. Discovering his artistic talents and succeeding in the mainstream art world after many years as a laborer in a Bessemer, Alabama railroad car manufacturing plant, Dial was intimately familiar with the dispossessed worlds from which he drew inspiration, assembling composite abstractions that, whether through their visual components or titles, acknowledged the grim realities that so many peoples of African descent faced. These two artworks obliquely addressed a pervading cultural melancholy that, despite a heightened visibility for artists of African descent, put into action art about Black trauma, and in tandem set the tone for debates about the perceived social worth of Black lives. Paradoxically, the 2008 election of US President Barack Obama, the first African-American to hold such a preeminent office, inspired countless Black Americans and others of African descent, and on the face of it, signified a shift towards greater racial inclusivity in the public sphere. However, as suggested in the aforementioned works by Bradford and Dial and their grave sentiments, this expanded racial purview was joined by cynicism by many Black observers and a frank admission to a not quite transformed racial consciousness. Deadly and violent encounters between Black people and the police fueled these misgivings. And under the rallying cry of Black Lives Matter by community activists and other concerned citizens, the world's watchers channeled this articulated anguish in remedial legislation, social media, and most pertinent to Black culture, in arts and letters. A parallel disquiet and sense of loss that permeated many African and African-descended communities revolved around issues of migration to the United States and industrialized countries in Europe. Fleeing political, social, and economic collapse in the developing world, and in many instances, facing lethal threats, Black and brown asylum seekers made harrowing journeys across land and sea, only to encounter antipathy and inhumaneness at international borders, or worse, perishing en route. This growth in migrants, especially from North and Sub-Saharan Africa, Central America, and the Caribbean, became a topic for numerous artists. And like the aforementioned art projects concerned with the perils and pitfalls of simply being Black, art about people of color moving through an often hostile and strange world appreciably contributed to an early 21st century art scene. Foremost among those artists whose work explored racial and cultural dislodgement, albeit through abstraction, was the Ghanaian-born, Nigerian-based sculptor El Anatsui. With massive, intermittently clustered and draped assemblages created from thousands of flattened aluminum liquor bottle caps fastened with copper wire, El Anatsui indirectly alluded to those millions of African fugitives making their way across the Sahara and Mediterranean in search of improved lives. Works like In the World, But Don't Know the World employed the environment-friendly practice of recycling inorganic waste, but reminiscent of fellow artistic bricoleurs David Hammons and Mr. Imagination, El Anatsui generated these corporeal insinuations through the art languages of surface embellishment and multi-pattern design. But not all abstract art by Black sculptors and painters in these years alluded to trauma, nor did this work necessarily draw on design systems and aesthetic sensibilities from the Black diaspora. In 2007, Julie Meretu, an Ethiopian-American painter, was commissioned by the Goldman Sachs Group Incorporated, an American multinational investment bank and financial service company, to create a painting for the firm's lobby of its recently built Lower Manhattan headquarters. Mural, comparable to Meretu's other large-scale paintings, incorporated geometric, boldly colored forms, fractional schematics of architecture, and free-form linear markings that in an illusionistic way moved in, out, and across the canvases, approximately 21 by 80 feet apportioned white field. Described as containing elements that refer to the history of finance capitalism, Meretu's mural fearlessly employed the precepts of an abstract graphic language to realize these economic and diagrammatic modes of representation. Often mistaken as panoramas or map-like, paintings like Julie Meretu's mural contain the conceptual, palimpsestic substructures present in all of her work, and as seen in mural's prominence in New York's public art cityscape, exemplified the novel and elevated stature many young Black artists achieved at the outset of the new millennium. Oddly, these years brought both Black exceptionalism and Black vulnerability, a layering of realities not dissimilar from the strata in Meretu's mural, and would be a contradiction that from the skyrocketing auction prices attained from works by Jean-Michel Basquiat, Mark Bradford, David Hammons, and Kerry James Marshall, to the ignoble number of African-American homicides by law enforcement, characterized contemporary Black art and life just before and after the deluge. Precarity and portraiture. A harbinger of this artistic perturbation concerning Black perceptibility, transience, and suffering surfaced earlier in two notable publications. Deborah Willis's Reflections in Black, A History of Black Photographers from 1840 to the Present, and James Allen's Without Sanctuary, Lynching Photography in America. Despite each book's respective editorial tenor and emotional distance from the other, they shared the importance of the photographic medium to an emergent modern Black identity and an appreciation for the body's pivotal place in a dialectical meditation on Black freedom. These themes and their formulations through photography were recurrent departure points for many artists at the beginning of the century, especially those whose works focused on racialized subjects, the intersectional roles of gender and sexuality, the underlying function and affect of images, and the all too familiar occurrence of the marketable turn disposable being. One of the earliest artistic benchmarks for this moment, Hank Willis Thomas's Branded Head, exposed the uncomfortable parallels between the contemporary culture's obsession with Black bodies, commonly manifested in sports, and Western civilization's sanctioning of Black subjugation, captured in the digitized image of an anonymous Black man's cranial scar in the shape of an athletic apparel company Nike's swoosh logo or brand. Taking Andy Warhol's mid-20th century critique of mass culture further than a pop art commentary and into visual dissimulation. Thomas's photography puts a plethora of pre-existing media images on trial for various crimes and misdemeanors. Thomas, along with a cohort of recombinant artists, placed the AIDS memoirs and cast-offs from the archives into service for an interrogation of African-American identities, with the photograph performing a distinctive and critical role. Although one of these recombinant artists, Rashid Johnson, would adopt a multidisciplinary practice of mixing media and utilizing unconventional materials, he began the century with a set of photographic self-portraits that introduced the idea of racial occlusion in terms of the impenetrability, despite the repetition, of Black images, while simultaneously and whimsically conversing with the past. One of those likenesses, self-portrait lying on Jack Johnson's grave, performed double duty, not just depicting the artist and paying homage to Jack Johnson, the world's first Black heavyweight boxing champion, but reenacting a corpse that, alas, was too common a sight on the streets of poor African-American neighborhoods. With these earlier inroads into photographic images that, whether digitally altered or staged, forged a pattern in which peoples of African descent became the principal characters in a tale of weighted objecthood. Photographers and other media-based artists in the century's second decade embarked on an analogous, part thematic, part stylistic path. Whether taking cues from the documentary tradition, as seen in LaToya Ruby Frazier's photographs of communities in existential crisis, or reimagining portrait studio photography, for example, Paul Impagi Sepuya's refracted and fragmented nudes. The camera and its operator portrayed not just the Black subject at the proverbial crossroads, but actual people and their artistic surrogates standing on the precipice of a universal tragedy. The mythic contours of Black narratives and their sundry protagonists were boldly foregrounded in Deanna Larson's The Garden, Jemena, Democratic Republic of Congo, whose subjects, rather than one-dimensional vehicles for narrow pictorial objectives, portrayed both themselves and personas, and whose Blackness, rather than polemical, was both matter-of-fact and visually potent, extending the photograph's narrative reach so as to plumb history, the present, perception, and the self, contributed to the medium's increased critical and popular appeal well into the 21st century, enabling it to exert its influence beyond the photograph proper and conspicuously into film, video, and painting. Artist and filmmaker John Onkomfra used the mystery surrounding the music and life of the legendary New Orleans jazz cornetist Buddy Bolden to create Precarity, a 3-channel video installation that, with its redolent soundtrack, long takes of taciturn actors, and filmed details of faded photographs and manuscripts, the latter submerged in a flowing stream, laid bare Precarity's partial debt to philosopher Roland Barthes' elegiac meditations in Camera Lucida. Akomfra, a founding member of the Black Audio Film Collective, was also motivated by the historical gaps, lost voices, and other unknowables missing from institutional archives and family albums in the African diaspora. Entitling this work Precarity, not only connected it to Bolden's precipitous descent from musical innovator to state mental hospital patient, but to the insecurities and life-threatening incidents that many Black people experienced in the 1910s. From police and vigilante excessive force against unarmed African Americans, to health disparities, government neglect, and environmental racism in Black communities worldwide. Photography brought viewers into a subliminal tete-a-tete with the figure in art. And in an era of suspect African-American fatalities, such as Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, Laquan McDonald, Sandra Bland, Freddie Gray, and Breonna Taylor, all Black faces in media-based artworks were kindred spirits to these contemporary martyrs. The media's role in raising the specter of a contemporary danse macabre with Black people in 2020 glaringly demonstrated in the filmed and widely broadcasted suffocation death of George Floyd by a Minneapolis police officer would haunt the collective consciousness, and along with the crimes themselves, be broadly viewed as accidental accessories. The portrait conscious impulse in these and other photography-based artworks prompted, ironically, painters to reassert the predominance of their chosen media in the portrait genre, but in ways that diverged significantly from camera-produced figurative art. In addition, with predecessors such as Alice Neal and Barclay L. Hendricks providing roadmaps, the factors of racial Blackness and a heretical subject diverted many 21st century portraitists along markedly different paths. One direction was work created in a painterly mode, where likeness was subordinate to a highly idiosyncratic and empathetic preconception. Lynette Yaya Boake's loosely executed canvases in subdued palettes and with Black subjects created from composite figures were representative of this gestural subjectivity. For example, Yaya Boake's 8 a.m. Cadiz, while not strictly a portrait, impersonated the genre's formal and psychological characteristics to the extent that these attributes, along with the painting's central animated Black man, co-opted the art of verisimilitude to advance an expressive and boundless Africanity. The other direction in contemporary Black portraiture, a revamped academicism, upended photography's representational authority and turned Black subjects into incarnations of, again, precarity, and on the other hand, a vaunted preeminence. The myriad ways in which painters like Meloko Mogosi, Toyin Odutola, Robert Pruitt, and Amy Sherald pictorially vaulted realism and instead conceived their sitters in contemporary painting idioms spoke to a greater acceptance of non-literal conceptions of Black bodies. Kehinde Wiley, a forerunner in this regard, made his mark by placing his subjects within vivid, highly decorative backgrounds and assuming exaggerated poses derived from old master paintings. In Wiley's acclaimed portrait of the 44th US President Barack Obama, the artist tempered his characteristic figural flamboyance and substituted it with a gravitas and urban cool, benefiting the first African-American in this esteemed position. And yet, this official portrait, for all of its propitious vegetation and bodily candor, incorporated Wiley's melancholic specter and atmosphere of memento mori when depicting Black subjects. Black Woman Remix. In 2004, the Spelman College Museum of Fine Art, an exhibition space in Atlanta, Georgia, devoted to presenting art by and about women of African descent, featured for the first time in the work of an emerging woman artist, Ayanna Roselle Brown. In sharp contrast to the museum's previous exhibitions, for example, the works of women quilters or legendary artists like Elizabeth Catlett, Roselle's show, entitled Afro-Asiatic Allegory, Black on Both Sides, was Au Courant, channeling African-American cultural sensibilities, but filtered through ukiyo-e, the traditional Japanese woodcut style, and the fashions of contemporary Japanese youth who emulated Black urban culture. Ayanna Rosiel Brown's Hushi, the Cinder, after Yoshitoshi's The Ghost of Taria no Tomomori appears at Diamotsu Bay, was very much a creation of its times, when Black artists embraced the mixtape techniques of DJs, MCs, and rap musicians, and Black women artists embarked on alternative feminist trajectories that probed beauty culture, queer identities, and society's assessments of the female body. Through her painting's main title, Brown playfully and rhetorically posed a question to which the painting's subject, a part cyborg, part Black woman stepping through tidal waves and exhaling Takashi Murakami-like figures, artistically answered, an idiosyncratic, active entity, unconstrained by cultural norms and boundaries, and yet at ease in her own skin. Around this same time, artist Mickalene Thomas also painted Black women in non-illusionistic, visually embellished settings. And like Ayanna Rosiel Brown and Kehinde Wiley, compositions that made references to art of the past. But what distinguished Thomas's Les Déjeuners sur l'herbe, Les Trois Femmes Noires, from Edouard Manet's similarly composed and titled 1862-63 painting, was an emphatic two-dimensionality, a mixed media format, and an assertive Black female presence, all conceived on a monumental scale with alternating touches of sarcasm and sincerity. It is this last characteristic, an emotional stance that swings between pride and defiance, and an eye-rolling admission of disproportionate theatricality and surface excess, that thrust Thomas's painting into what the poet and essayist Alexis Pauline Gumbs describes as a world of the uncontainable, and work that defies the oppressive interlocking set of narratives that entrap Black women every day. The works of Brown, Thomas, and others were responses to the out of proportion visuality that Black women faced in an era of Facebook, Instagram, and intensified media scrutiny. From the popular culture's fascination with the music and images of pop stars Rihanna and Beyonce, to the media's fixations on the bodies, clothing, and hairstyles of the United States' First Lady Michelle Obama and the United Kingdom's Duchess of Sussex, Meghan Markle. Black women bore a spectatorial burden in these years. But rather than creating Black female images that receded and disappeared from center stage, Black women artists spotlit their sisters, investing them with a distinction and social significance that, while reminiscent of earlier forays into the Black female subject by artists Elizabeth Catlett, Faith Ringgold, and Betty Saar, expanded the representational possibilities. Simone Lee, a sculptor conversant in traditional African art and architecture, as well as in modern sculptural overtures to a reductive abstraction, brought these lineages together in Brick House, a 16 feet high bronze statue of a stylized Black woman's head atop a dome-like base. Temporarily installed on New York's High Line, Brick House loomed over the congested traffic beneath it like a postmodern Afrocentric effigy, evoking an ancient atropaic harem. For a work of art to successfully compete for the public's attention amidst Midtown Manhattan visual noise required it to have both architectonic and denotative audacity, all contained in Lee's bold Black female form. Simone Lee's Brick House, in its open air interrogation of Black female imagery at a moment of high apperception and public debate had a thematic antecedent 5 years prior. In artist Carol Walker's temporary sculptural installation in Brooklyn, New York, titled A Subtlety, or The Marvelous Sugar Baby, an homage to the unpaid and overworked artisans who have refined our sweet tastes from the cane fields to the kitchens of the New World on the occasion of the demolition of the Domino sugar refining plant. Walker's phalanx of sugar fabricated anthropomorphic forms, most prominently among them, a 35-foot tall, sphinx-like female figure with distinct African facial features and unclothed body, and in the manner of a stereotypic Aunt Jemima character, a handkerchief-bound head, drew thousands of viewers to the installation's site and predictably elicited far-reaching kudos and criticism. Known for her provocative, two-dimensional works that conceptually probed and reimagined African-American stereotypes, master-slave dynamics, and suppressed memories of sexual abuse and racial trauma, Walker turned here to the ultimate symbol of American racism, the romanticized, subservient Southern US mammy. And by way of this figure's ancient Egyptian form, saccharine addictive allusions and symbolic whiteness confounded a superficial construal of the Black female subject and stereotype. Walker's A Subtlety was an enigma on par with Frantz Fanon's black skin, white mask metaphor, and a satire in which the stereotype's patent fallacy and irrepressible, maddening dream work artfully coexist. Tomorrow's Temple. After years of congressional bills, presidential commissions, and bureaucratic false starts, at the end of 2003, the 108th Congress of the United States of America enacted legislation to establish in Washington, D.C., a new freestanding Museum of African American History and Culture. In January 2006, an unoccupied site near the Washington Monument was selected as the museum's location. And 3 years later, a team consisting of the Freelon Group of Durham, North Carolina, the London-based Age Associates, New York City's Davis Brody Bond architectural firm, and the Detroit-based Smith Group JJR was selected from 22 competing groups to design this museum. Sir David Age, O-B-E-R-A, Age's associate principal and the lead designer on this project, imagined a building that would establish both a meaningful relationship to this unique site, as well as a strong conceptual resonance with America's deep and long-standing African heritage. By most critical standards, Age's design for the National Museum of African American History and Culture succeeded in fulfilling these objectives, notably in the building's iconic overall configuration, a three-tiered rectangular crown motif of inverted half pyramids, inspired from works by the early 20th century Nigerian sculptor Olowe of Ise, matching the 17-degree angle of the Washington Monument's pointed capstone. The entire building was wrapped in 3,600 bronze-colored cast aluminum panels, filigreed in an abstract pattern based on the intricate ironwork created by Black craftsmen in Charleston, South Carolina, and New Orleans, Louisiana. An enormous roof over the museum's south entrance formed an expansive portico, extending the building out onto the National Mall and covering a shallow pool of water that cools bystanders during Washington's sweltering summers. These distinct design elements, along with 400,000 square feet of exhibition space, public areas, and the accompanying educational programs immediately made the National Museum of African American History and Culture one of the most popular museums in the United States, on average attracting 2.4 million visitors annually. A month prior to the opening of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, Bryan Stevenson, the director of the Equal Justice Initiative, a nonprofit in Montgomery, Alabama, that provided legal aid to wrongly convicted and poorly represented prisoners, announced plans to build a memorial to the thousands of victims of racial lynchings in the United States. The idea for a national memorial, the first of its kind to honor the casualties of extrajudicial killings, arose in 2010 when the Equal Justice Initiative began a comprehensive investigation into this 70-year-plus history of racial terrorism, much of which had never been documented. Set on an elevated 6-acre site in a residential neighborhood in Montgomery, Alabama, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice at first glance recalled other well-known memorials wrestling with difficult histories of genocide, apartheid, and horrific human losses. But unlike these projects, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, conceived and designed by Bryan Stevenson and his colleagues in collaboration with the Boston-based nonprofit architectural firm Mass Design Group Limited, was conceptually bound to very specific regional histories. The Hillside Memorial, a square, international-style canopy temple structure with a large peristyle adjacent to a compact above-ground cemetery, featured over 800 weathering steel rectangle boxes, each 6 feet in height. Hanging from the structure's ceiling, one for every US county where lynchings took place, and each bearing victims' names, more than 4,000, and the dates of their deaths. Upon entering the memorial, visitors encountered the suspended steel boxes at eye level, but soon thereafter, the floor gradually descended into the structure's concrete base, creating the effect of the boxes slowly rising over visitors' heads, like hanging, lynched bodies. Visitors exited the structure towards an open-air morgue-like area. There, duplicates of the hanging boxes are horizontally arranged on the ground and in alphabetical order by state, aiding visitors who are seeking out specific locations and victims. Stevenson's concept for the memorial factored in the possibility that individual counties would claim these duplicate steel boxes and properly bury them, and that the municipalities which refused would be shamed by their presence on the grounds of the memorial. Stevenson's vision to honor the dead, reflect upon the present day meaning of lynching and racial injustice, and educate the public about these suppressed facts of US history, required a memorial that, despite the painful subject matter, aimed to heal. Similarly, the Freelon, Auger, Bond, Smith Group's design for the African American Museum required architectural citations that would counter the orthodox and hierarchical aspects of Washington, D.C.'s federal core. Both structures coming into existence at an uncertain, anxiety-filled moment for many African Americans and other marginalized US communities, enacted spatial rejoinders to the historic discrimination and endangerment. These sites were conceived as cultural termini that, rather than imitating neoclassical preserves, fashioned themselves as ethically inspired spaces. Reasserting the Harlem Renaissance poet Langston Hughes's 1926 proclamation that we build our temples for tomorrow, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice did not realize their respective institutional callings with white marble columns, but instead with Corten steel, burnished aluminum, and a combination modern handcrafted aesthetic charged with recounting unvarnished histories as a call for restoration and political action. Remarkably, these two testaments to African American history came into being at the same time as the widespread despoliation and purging of dozens of public monuments commemorating the Civil War era Confederate States of America, European colonialism, and Western civilization's subjugation and annihilation of Black and Brown indigenous peoples. Grassroots activists have long petitioned for the removal of these mostly pre-1950 symbols of America's and Europe's dishonorable past pertaining to peoples of color. But it wasn't until the second decade of the 21st century that local governments and organized protesters rejected bureaucratic procedures and took matters into their own hands, attacking and tearing down these embodiments of racism and imperialism. Although many of these iconoclastic outbreaks followed highly publicized incendiary incidents of unlawful Black deaths, the global economic downturn, racial pessimism, and a pervasive social malaise certainly fueled and helped ignite these far-reaching retributive actions. Projections for a new millennium. For all of the paradigm-shifting media-based works that artists of African descent produced at the end of the 20th century, the first 2 decades of the 21st century ushered in an even more extraordinary group of Black films, videos, and digital works. These media-based artworks radically altered the motion picture and small screen genre, incorporating, like in no previous era, a broad array of Black images. From Spike Lee's bitterly acerbic Bamboozled to Ryan Coogler's imagistically spectacular Black Panther, Hollywood deviated from its tried and true formulae and incorporated entirely different stories, characters, and most significantly, atmospheres and moods, much of this bringing Black truths and fantasies into an expanded cinematic consciousness. What also pushed cinema to reinvent itself, often utilizing a Black diasporal ambience and alternative modes of storytelling, was the competition the film industry faced beginning in the late 1990s from newly formed media streaming outlets and their digital providers. These entertainment networks, recognizing a previously unfilled niche for cutting-edge programs geared towards a much broader demographic than the conventional film and television offerings, circumvented the major film studios and created their own made-for-cable and online program, for which they hired emerging artists of color whose products drew audiences far beyond the targeted pool of subscribers. For example, video sharing platforms like YouTube and Vimeo introduced the performances of innovative Black musicians like Childish Gambino or Donald Glover, videos that precipitated Glover's critically acclaimed comedic and dramatic television series Atlanta on the FX channel. It was also on YouTube where the public fully absorbed the artistic range of fin de siècle pop star Beyonce, which ultimately led to her 3 most popular video presentations towards the end of the first quarter of the 21st century: Lemonade, a visual album, Homecoming, and Black is King, premiering respectively on the media service providers HBO, Netflix, and Disney+. Many of these new Black television shows and long-form music videos carry the unmistakable imprint of Arthur Jaffa. a cinematographer whose critically acclaimed work on Julie Dash's Daughters of the Dust and Spike Lee's Crooklyn brought a heretofore absent, refreshing cinematic afterglow to Black and brown bodies. Under Jaffa's directorial aegis, this same attention to lighting and vividly capturing peoples of color on film was augmented by a circumspect position on Black subject matter, a viewpoint that, in spite of an appreciation for the rich complexities of African-American life, was counterbalanced by a profound gravity and subtext of mortality. A film by Jaffa in this milieu was Dreams Are Colder Than Death, a documentary that interrogated the meaning of Blackness and the consequences of Martin Luther King Jr.'s proverbial dream at a moment when disappointment and anxieties in Black communities proliferated. Soliciting the insights of a virtual who's who of contemporary Black artists and intellectuals, Jaffa placed the absorbing words of these pundits alongside Black history photographs, filmed highways and crashing ocean surfs, and evocative, slowed down footage of ordinary Black people going about their everyday lives. The latter underscoring the disconnect between the experiences and ideas of cultural critics, King's platitudes, and the fatality-shaped realities of the Black quotidian. Well into the 21st century, many Black artists had become cynical about the contemporary social circumstances and future prospects of peoples of African descent. That works like Arthur Jaffa's Dreams Are Colder Than Death and other films, videos, and computer-generated artworks contained a significant measure of pessimism, or at least distrust and foreboding in matters of racial equity and inclusion, was also present in media artist Sandra Perry's It's in the Game 17, or Mirror Gag for Vitrine and Projection, and immersive sculpture and video installation, examining how digital technology was frequently implicated in incapacitating synopses of peoples of African descent. Gallery visitors moving through It's in the Game 17 were compelled to pause at several critical junctures, opposite a projection of Perry and her twin brother Sandy, a college basketball player, viewing 3D depictions of African sculptures in New York and London museums, before Perry's animation of Sandy, whose image had been sold years earlier to a collegiate basketball video game developer without his consent, and in front of several small video screens affixed to metal basketball shot trainers, each showing grisly 3D medical renderings of Sandy's head from the interiors of his eye sockets and nasal cavities. The soundtrack for much of this imagery, a slowed down version of You Are Everything by the 1970s soul group The Stylistics, subliminally conveyed Perry's concerns about the contemporary co-opting of Black identities and narratives, and about the uneasy relationship between identity and the latest imaging technologies, or what she described as the abstraction of subjecthood in digital representations of Black people. Afrofuturists. Despite on-again, off-again efforts as early as the 1990s, in 2005, the Marvel Studio film production company announced that a forthcoming motion picture would be based on the Black Panther, the first superhero of African descent to appear in a mainstream American comic book series. Theatrically released in 2018, the film Black Panther, directed by Ryan Coogler, mixed comic book action sequences, dramatic special effects, science fiction, and an African diasporal mise-en-scène to reap broad critical accolades and commercial success, earning over $1.3 billion worldwide and becoming the 9th highest grossing film of all time. Apart from its melodramatic storyline of royal succession, leadership rivalry, and global revolution, Black Panther spectacularly illustrated Afrofuturism, a ubiquitous concept that re-examined the lived realities of Black people through science fiction, speculative interpretations, and theories of racial othering and social alienation. In a 2003 essay by the British Ghanaian writer and filmmaker Kojo Eshun, he contended that Afrofuturism was a chronopolitical act for many contemporary African artists, whose historically informed and theoretically plotted conceptions of Blackness demonstrated the possibilities for intervention within the dimension of the predictive, the projected, the proleptic, the envisioned, the virtual, the anticipatory, and the future conditional. As with Kugler's Black Panther and its allusions to real-life prejudices and third world disparities, Afrofuturism used extraterrestriality as an analogy for Black Atlantic subjectivity, a condition that, especially through the popular novels of the science fiction writer Octavia E. Butler, was often associated with Black women who have historically withstood and strategically seized the stigma of alienation to their advantage. This otherworldly view by the proponents of Afrofuturism, aspiring towards hybridity and a bionic identity, or at the very least, modeling the Black self beyond a white, heterosexual, and male exemplar, seemed to be the underlying message in sculptor and performance artist Nick Cave's contemporaneous sound suits. Wearable fabric sculptures that, with their improbable proportions and surface energies, evoked extraterrestrial African maskers and space inhabitants. The aberrant yet striking figures that Nick Cave's sound suits conjured aligned with Afrofuturism's inclinations towards a non-conforming Black aesthetic, a criterion that, as the decade progressed, expanded and morphed into a disembodied semiotic Blackness. Unabashedly embracing the illusory nature of a Black Atlantic imaginary, and relatedly Afrofuturism's basis in speculation and theory. Beginning in 2011, artist Kapwani Kiwanga launched Afrogalactica, which via audio and film projections, public readings, and role-playing, analyzed and enacted the tenets of Afrofuturism. Taking on the role of an anthropologist from the future, Kiwanga used historical chronicles, mythology, pop culture, and scientific protocols to provide alternative histories of the African diaspora, to challenge and undermine hegemonic Western discourses, and ultimately to envisage the future. By combining different genres and forms of knowledge related to Afrofuturism, including memorable quotes from the celebrated jazz musician Sun Ra, to a mid to late 20th century promoter of space travel and interplanetary refuge for Black people, Kiwanga put Afrogalactica in furtherance of this theory's adherence to simulation and prognostication. If science fiction's emphasis on worlds to come fulfills its mission by concurrently scrutinizing the present alongside the past, as a parallel genre, Afrofuturism bridged speculative narration with a Black diasporal ethos, cognizant of its philosophical locus in ancient Africa, as well as its contemporary investitures and prerogatives. In another temporary installation, this one for the Corinthian columned accented facade of New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art, artist Wangechi Mutu conjoined these various theoretical strains to create 4 bronze sculptures that, with 19th century architect Richard Morris Hunt's building as a backdrop, realized what social scientists and cultural theorist Alondra Nelson described as Afrofuturism's quest to find artistic models that transform spaces of alienation into novel forms of creative potential. The 4 sculptures, collectively titled The New Ones, Will Free Us, and individually subtitled The Seated 1, 2, 3, and 4, depicted their hieratic, stylized female subjects enveloped from chin to toe in serpentine coils, each sporting on its head a highly polished bronze disc. Mutu's previous work in paintings, collages, assemblages, and video animation frequently included female figures that, rather than naturalistic, gave viewers the impressions of part human, part animal monstrosities and androids, not so expressly malevolent as unearthly and mystical, and similar to the seated quartet. Complementary to the Met's exterior architecture and yet refreshingly dissonant in their eccentricity and luminosity, Mutu's enthroned New Ones, amphibious, African, and astral, provided a visual and speculative antidote to, again paraphrase Nelson's description of Afrofuturism, to an unbridled, raceless future lust. At different moments throughout a bright Manhattan day, several of the sculptures comprising the New Ones, Will Free Us, captured the sun in their upraised bronze plates, and reflecting the radiance back, activated the Metropolitan Museum's austere Beaux-Arts exterior. Wangechi Mutu's futuristic public works expressed the promise and ensuing light of these intelligent life forms and their earthly counterparts, even in the context of the 2020 worldwide pandemic and its human cost. One can only speculate, after 2 decades of phenomenal achievements and social disasters, what the Black cultural conditions will be for the rest of the 21st century, and whether the price of Blackness, as the conceptual artist Keith Obadike first broached in 2001 said, holds its value or reaps the consequence of gauges and frames of critical reference beyond its already expansive cosmic breadth. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Powell. Thank you, Dr. Powell. That was brilliant and masterful. And I feel like it's so timely, the topic that you've shared with us. I want to first just congratulate you again for this wonderful and brilliant masterpiece, Tour de Force. And I want to remind everyone who's with us this evening, we have about 15 minutes for questions for Dr. Powell. So please, if you would, share your questions in the chat. I did want to begin just by saying how, as I said, how timely this feels. And I know that when we first discussed your distinguished lecture, my first thought was, well, it's going to be a talk about going there, because I knew the book was coming out and I was really excited to hear more about it. And of course you said, no, actually, I'm going to do something new. And so you've gifted us with something new and really a lot to think about. And so Dr. Powell, I wanted to ask you if you could maybe share, in addition to this huge and enormous gift that we'll all remember, that you've given to students at the AUC, are there other ways that we might imagine, reading the work that you're writing? And I know that, and we all know, of course, that Your Black Art is a book that, we call a Bible. We teach it all of the time. But we also know that it was about maybe almost 20 years ago that it was last reissued. So if you could maybe share something about that and the process of writing a masterpiece like that.
Well, first of all, let me say that I decided for this lecture that you kindly invited me to give you a sneak preview of the third edition. So what I read to you today will appear in the third edition of Black Art, A Cultural History, which, as you mentioned, was first published in '97, and then the second edition was done in 2002, although I really finished it in 2001. So as you know so well, Dr. Finley, as someone who is part of the history of African-American art of the recent past, a whole lot has happened since 2000. And so I thought it would be useful for our students and our faculty and just our community in this presentation to look back at the past 20 years and to think about not just art, but how the art is framed in a cultural moment. And I wanted to call it the price of Blackness because, as you know so well, this is a moment where African-American art has exploded and has become, the go-to item to in auction houses. I was reading the other day that Robert Colescott's George Washington Carver Crossing the Delaware, which he probably sold to the couple that owned it in the 1970s for something like 4 figures, is now being projected at bringing in something like, just millions and millions and millions of dollars. It's kind of unreal, the numbers, and he's only one of many. But the irony is that alongside this incredible high visibility is George Floyd.
Right, and it's that hyper visibility.
Exactly.
Of the Black body.
And so we're dealing with visibility on multiple levels. We're dealing with the visibility of art, but also the visibility of Black bodies, and also Black bodies being in the kind of the eye of the gun, a la Elizabeth Catlett's Target, or Target practice by Ollie Harrington in my book Going There. So this is a strange moment, and but it's an important moment, and it's also a moment that I'm heartened by young minds and young people who are ready to face the world in a very different way than I face the world. They're ready to face it with much more, I would say, political acumen and activism, in their belly. And also a perspicacity, a consciousness of this strange hypervisibility, and the challenge of not being caught in it in a kind of a vice, but to understand just how far we have come and how far we have to go. I don't know if that answered your question, but this is a moment where I really felt like I wanted to look back and think broadly about where we are. And that's why that Thames and Hudson book has been such a boon to me, because I like looking back, and I also like to look at the present. And so this project has really allowed me to kind of get that 365-degree overview of not just Blackness, but art.
Yeah, and I think that broad view that you provide has been so useful to so many. I mean, that's why the book is so very popular and so very necessary, that you not just go through different media, from performance to photography to painting to installation to sculpture, but you also think about the way in which we might consider portraiture from different lenses. And I think that that's something that really, continues to keep it really rich and something that we go to all the time. There are quite a few questions here in the chat, so I just want to see if we can get to those before we run out of time. The first thing I want to share is that Gloria Gales has said to you, Dr. Powell, you were brilliant as always. You are the best teacher I ever had. So that's a big shout out to you, Dr. Powell. Then we have a question from Loki Muthu, who has given us, I think, our first 3 questions of the day. One is, and I'm going to try to put 2 of them together. One is, how can the younger generation spur correction in ensuring proper visibility, inclusivity, and presence of African American art and artists as part of the overall American art fabric?
My immediate answer, and I know our time is limited, so I'm going to do this in as truncated a way as possible. I think one of the keys is to learn history and to really think about African American art in this broader historical context. I just taught a class this semester at Duke on art of the United States. And it's hard to find a good textbook that's inclusive. So the assignment that I gave my students at the end of the semester is that I had one group to supplement the book with African American art of the past 20 years, Latinx art of the past 20 years, and then LGBTQ plus art of the past 20 years. And I had the students working on it and adding it and thinking about it in relationship to what they had seen earlier. So my answer is to really, see our culture and our art as a key component of what it means to be American, what it means to be modern, and to have that perspective. Because when you have that perspective, I think you can understand and realize how great and how important our contributions have been.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. So I have another question that I would like to ask. This is from Ben Hickey. When is the third edition available for purchase?
It's coming out at the end of the year. Everything is it's Thames and Hudson, which is based in London, mm-hmm. and I believe it's in production now because we've done all of that. So we should be looking at
in the fall, probably.
Yeah, in the fall at some point.
Okay.
Yeah, so look out for it.
So Mr. Hickey has another question that I think is related to this, and this is something that, for our students and even faculty for that matter, it's a question about your use of language. One of the things that, there's so many things that I can say that I adore and appreciate and learn from about your career and your scholarship, Dr. Powell. And one is, just your use of language, your delivery, your very specific and attuned use of words. There's not going to be a repetition of the same modifier in any work that you write, which, again, we learn from, these very important words that you use. And so the question is, how do you balance the need to use academic language with its ability to alienate people? That's the question. And I don't ever feel alienated by your writing. I always feel uplifted and, just kind of like energized by the fact that I don't, hear the same, words over and over again to that we often find actually in, writing in art history or writing in curatorial studies when we do formal analyses, for example.
I'm almost chuckling to myself because I never consider myself or view myself as this kind of highbrow egghead who spins out lots of fancy words. I'm looking at Gloria Wade Gales' name, and I just have fond memories of getting that Strunk & White book and really learning the fundamentals of writing, where you don't talk unless you have something to say. One. And the reality is that sometimes you need to use interesting and different words to say what it is that you want to say. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's nothing wrong with kind of pulling on what's possible in order to do justice to the complexity and the challenges of a lot of the work that we're looking at. It's what I've shown you today, from Mark Bradford to Julie Moretu to Wangechi Mutu. These are complex works. And I think one of the good things, Mr. Hickey, is that these are illustrated books. So if you are challenged, look at the pictures and maybe think about what it is that I'm trying to engage with. There is a subject and there is a predicate in all of the sentences that I create. Mm-hmm. Although, when you want to say a lot of things with a limited amount of space, you have to kind of make some tough decisions. I will say that the Thames and Hudson editorial team has really taught me to pare down.
Right.
I mean, this is a book that's going to end up being maybe 300 some pages, which really isn't a lot for several centuries of art. So it's actually less than what it might seem in some of the verbiage that I use. But my verbiage is totally connected to the complexity and intricacies and sophistication of the art that I'm looking at. And I want to do justice to that work.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing to say too, you've mentioned your publisher, Thames and Hudson. This is a book that's part of a popular series that reaches, thousands and thousands of students and art historians. And it is written in such a way that, as you said, speaks to the complexity of the moment and of the work, and of the artists and the particularities of the moments. But it also is something that speaks broadly to so many people, because it has to, right? That's the breadth and the reach that you're aiming for. So I think this might possibly be the last question, but it depends on how long, of an answer you might give for it. The question is from H. Richmond. Dr. Powell, how do you think artists will capture or memorialize this current reckoning of social justice in the United States? How do you think it will compare to previous historical social shifts? Thank you.
That's an excellent question. And I don't know. To be absolutely honest with you, I'm not someone who can predict the future, but I do know that we're all deeply moved by our lives and what's been going on in the Black community over the past couple of years. It's just really clear that we are not the same, and we will never be the same. And so I imagine artists may actually be much more engaged and politically committed than they've been, which is not to say that they haven't been politically engaged and committed previously, but maybe it might be more explicit. Maybe it's going to be perhaps more kind of straight arrow-like in its critiques and in its interrogations. On the other hand, you cannot predict, because what makes artists so brilliant is that they surprise you. They do not do what you think they're going to do. They're going to do something else. They're going to raise the ante on what constitutes the visual. And that's why it's exciting. I mean, if we could predict it, we would look at it and walk away. What's going to be great is that they're going to lay something on us and we're going to say, wow, I didn't even think that could ever be conceived of and created. One thing that we'll have to look at, I'm sure that many of your folks know that coming up at Venice Biennale, we have Simone Lee representing the US. We have Sonia Boyce representing the UK. We have Zainab Sedira representing France. We've got Stan Douglas representing Canada. I mean, have you ever heard of a moment, Dr. Finley, when all of these Black artists are going to be representing these major countries in the West? So I have a feeling that, in answer to your question, Mr. Richmond, just go to Venice in June and we're going to see how people are responding.
Right. I think that's the best recommendation of all. And it's going to be something akin to 2003, right? I can't say enough about your talk, Dr. Powell, about the reception that we've received in the chat. All of this is going to be saved and available to stream from the AUC Art Collective website in the future, in the very near future. And we just want to, again, embrace you and send out all kinds of gratitude for your scholarship and for your commitment to the field, to your students. It really makes a difference because, we read your work, we have the great ability to also, at least I have, I know the last time I did an introduction, which was on Monday, for a private lunch that we had with students, I said that of all the exhibitions that I read that you've done, I've actually seen every last one of them. So we have, this great benefit, from your scholarship and your work. And I think that it's something too that, we should share with our students, that they should know that it also filters through the people that you've mentored over the years. And that shows by the reception. So once again,
Dr. Finley, the people who have mentored me, like Dr. Gloria Wade Gales, like Richard Long at Atlanta University. I mean, the list goes on and on of incredible professors that I had at at Morehouse and at Spelman and at Clark Atlanta University. I mean, I do what I do because they made it possible for me to think and be the person I am. So I profoundly thank you, Gloria Wade Gales, and all of the other faculty and community of the AU Center. It was really important in my development.
Thank you so much, Dr. Powell. And it's been important for us to have you as an alum. So thank you so much again, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you.
Good night all.